I know you're out there. You're listening. You're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't see the future. I'm not here to tell you how this is going to end. I'm here to tell you how this is going to begin. I'm going to start this broadcast, and when I do, I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. A world without controls and boundaries. A world where anything is possible.
Hey guys, how you doing? It's Tom. It is tax day, so I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk to you about the history of the federal income tax in the United States of America, as well as federal taxation as it is today. In 1911, Nelson Aldrich proposed the 16th Amendment, which would give Congress the authority to levy a federal income tax. Now, just 10 years earlier, Aldrich had argued that a federal income tax is communistic, which at the time was a great insult. It was bad, bad, bad. But between that time and 1911, his daughter had married robber baron, one of the most powerful men, perhaps the most powerful man in the United States of America, John D. Rockefeller. So Aldrich, 1911, proposes the 16th Amendment, and it is passed and ratified in 1913. Well, at least it's allegedly ratified. There is some controversy around that. Some people argue that 8 states never actually ratified the 16th Amendment. Therefore, the IRS doesn't have authority to collect federal income taxes. If you're more interested in that, there is a documentary titled Freedom to Fascism by Aaron Russo. It's available on YouTube. I'll include it in the reference notes. Very interesting stuff. But anyway, 1913, the amendment passes. Congress has the ability now to levy the federal income tax. The Rockefellers, of course, now part of the Aldrich family, intricately linked to the federal income tax. Something that also happened in 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank, which created a monopoly. It gave the Federal Reserve Bank a monopoly over the creation of money in the United States of America. Now, if you read the book The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, who is perhaps the greatest historian I've ever come across, you would know that years before the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank, and this is well documented, there was a meeting on Jekyll Island in Georgia between the Rockefeller family, the Rothschild banking dynasty, and the J.P. Morgan family. Right? J.P. Morgan was a man, not just a banking institution. And they schemed, because they were competitors, they said, let's not compete. They schemed to create a monopoly over the nation's money supply. And through their money and power, Nelson Aldrich, and of course leveraging money through many senators, they were able to get the Federal Reserve Bank created, giving them a quasi-government corporate monopoly over the creation of money, as well as giving the government the ability to levy a federal income tax. Why is the income tax important? Well, think about it. These bankers created a debt-based system in which they had a monopoly over. So now they could print unlimited amounts of money, it's fiat currency, backed by nothing except the full word and credit of the United States government. And how is the government going to pay them back? Through taxation. So now, when these bankers create money, they lend it to the government gives them an IOU, and these bankers get interest on that money that's paid back to them through taxation, federal taxation. It is the greatest theft scheme in the history of the world. But of course, the media, the academic system, it's all corrupt, so no one's going to tell you how this stuff works. So it's fiat currency, it's backed by nothing except that the government's going to tax us, which they weren't able to do prior to 1913. And it's also fractional reserve banking, which means For every $10 a bank puts out into the economy, they only have to keep $1 worth of reserves. So banks don't even have your money on hand. It's nonsense. It's all, yeah, here's money and we have it. The only way they have it is that it's backed by the government will tax you to get it, and that the bankers can create money out of nothing. And of course, this is the hidden tax, because the more money that they're printing out of nothing, the more inflation there is. And inflation, especially over decades, greatly devalues the money system. It devalues the dollar, which is why you hear your grandpa say, I used to be able to go to the movies for a quarter. And then you hear your mom say, I used to be able to go to the movies for just $3. And now you say, I go to the movies for $40. Because inflation, our money has been devalued. And you would think more people would be aware of this, but of course the same oligarchs that took over the financial system also took over the education system. So if you research the Reese Committee, spearheaded by Norman Dodd, you would know that in the early 1900s, right around when the Federal Reserve Bank was being created, these same oligarchs, the Carnegie Foundation, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, they got together and they realized that they needed to control the public mind. So they got together and schemed a way to take over the American education system. And they did that through a couple of means, among them using grants as leverage. This is what you teach, this is the methods that you use, and if you do, you'll get these grants from the Rockefellers who have more money than you could ever know what to do with, especially once they gain the ability to print money out of nothing and then receive taxpayer money back for printing that money out of nothing. And among that, they would also push for the government intervention into the education system, which of course today we have this gigantic Department of Education, which should be abolished. So people aren't aware of how this works because the education system is so broken. So now people think that federal taxation is altruistic. And you get the arguments from people. Basically, what you hear is, if you don't support federal taxation, if you don't support increased taxation, let alone just keeping taxation the same or lowering taxes, then you don't care about the poor. It's either high taxes or you don't care about the poor. You don't want the poor to have food stamps, then you don't want the poor to eat, right? Because without food stamps, the poor starve. If you don't want the poor to have public housing, then you want them to live on the streets, to be homeless. Now, of course, this goes against reality, right? Americans are the most charitable people in the world. But American charity can only go so far, and a big part of the reason for that is we are taxed at such an astronomical rate. I mean, just imagine for a second that Americans weren't taxed at 20, 30%. How much more money they would have. For example, let's say someone makes $100,000 and they're taxed at 20%. Well, now they've already lost $20,000. So now they have only $80,000. And then they're paying state taxes. So let's knock another 5 off of that. Now they have $75,000. They have to buy food. Now they have $65,000. And they have to, maybe they have a car payment. So now they have $55,000. And now they have a mortgage, which is another $2,000 a month. So now they're down to $20,000, $25,000, plus whatever expenses. They're going to buy themselves clothing. They're going to buy their children clothing. They're going to want to go out to dinner. They don't have a lot of money left over to be charitable. And of course, the public mindset also changes, because how could I give my money to charity when the government's taking all my money? They're supposed to be taking care of this. But of course, the government does a very bad job of this. So instead of people taking charity as their responsibility, as they used to do, they rely on this welfare state, which allegedly is supposed to take care of people, but it really doesn't do a good job of that. Now take the same example, because this welfare state, which is speared on by taxation and people not being charitable, also creates a permanent state of dependence. So take that same example, right? $100,000, someone has a lot of money. But we just broke it down and said, okay, well, they make $100,000, a lot of money. Well, actually, they have about $20,000 left over. And then if they're being reasonable, they're going out to dinner, they're going to Six Flags, maybe one vacation a year that they want to go on. They don't have much money left over, let alone any type of nest egg, especially with this big mortgage hanging over their head. So it's very unlikely that someone making $100,000 is going to say, okay, it's worth me taking the astronomical risk of starting a business, investing my capital into something where if something goes wrong, I could very quickly lose my house, my family's out on the street, and so forth. Whereas if there was no federal income tax, right? If there was no federal income tax, now they have an extra $20,000. If we're saying it's 20%, it's probably more 25, 30%. So $25,000, $30,000. Now they have a nest egg. Now taking a risk becomes more reasonable. So people can pursue their own American dream. So now people take their $20,000 that they have a little bit of a nest egg, they invest it, they pursue their American dream to start a business. Now they go from making $100,000, their business is successful, they make $300,000, $500,000, $1 million. Imagine how much more charitable they could be because they're not being taxed at an astronomical rate. Not to mention, they've now created more businesses. They've changed the supply and demand ratio, so there's more jobs available for low-wage workers. If there's more jobs available, more jobs in the same amount of workers, now the supply-demand ratio changes, and the value of that work that the low-income workers can do becomes more valuable, and their incomes naturally rise. But because we're being taxed at such an astronomical rate, we don't see this charity. We do see charity from the American people, but not as much as there would be. And we see a permanent underclass created by this federal income tax, by this debt society, this inflation society, and this taking away the ability of people to invest their own money. So because of that, what you see is the rich getting much richer, the middle class evaporating, and the poor being stagnant rather than being mobile as they should be. Politicians know this, but it's beneficial to them to say, we're going to give you this, we're going to give you that, so please vote for us. So the politicians plead to class warfare. They go out on television and they say, we need to tax the 1%. Look how much money they have. Look how few taxes they pay. It's not right. Look at the widening gap between the rich and the poor. What they don't tell you is that the 1% encompasses not just your people that are making billions of dollars a year, but also the people that make $300,000, $400,000. These are all quote-unquote 1%ers. People who, if they weren't being taxed so much, could invest more money into their own businesses for selfish reasons so that they make more money, but also creating more business, changing supply and demand, creating more job opportunity for people who make less money, providing them opportunity to rise into the middle class. And the politicians are supported by the very 1% who they are allegedly targeting with their plan for increased taxation. Let me give you an example. Jeffrey Bezos owns Amazon.com and the Washington Post. Now, I don't think anyone would argue that Bezos doesn't push hard left-wing politics, which is increased taxation, using the Washington Post. Why does he do this? He does this because he knows that he's going to use tax loopholes. He has a secret agreement, not so secret now, with the government of Luxembourg called Project Goldcrest, in which he basically pays no taxes in the agreement with Luxembourg. So Bezos knows that if he could get the public angry and make them want to tax the top 1%, they're going to tax people that make $500,000 a year, $1 million a year, $5 million a year. They're going to tax his competition so that they can't compete with him. When these politicians go on television and say we need to increase taxation, they're not doing it because they're altruistic. They're doing it because they're using the government to create de facto monopolies as they avoid paying taxes through loopholes and outsourcing their money overseas. And then, of course, the other argument you hear is, well, if you get rid of the federal income tax, will there be roads? Well, have you ever seen a picture before 1913? There were roads in those pictures. There were roads before 1913, and there would be roads without a federal income tax. America functioned fine prior to 1913. In fact, America was very weary altogether of a federal taxation, and that's why America was founded in 1776, but the federal income tax wasn't created until 1913. It was added in a constitutional amendment. So all that time, there was no federal income tax except a short period of time during the Civil War. America was very weary of taxation because America had just broken free from a monarchical king, right? So the American Revolution was actually in large part started over a 3% tax on tea. I mean, think about this. These people declared war against the most powerful army, navy, military in the world over a 3% tax on tea. And of course, that tax, if you do your historical reading, the monarch didn't put that tax on just to get some extra revenue. They actually did that because the British East India Tea Company was upset that the colonies were cutting into their businesses. So the oligarchs of the British East India Company pressured the monarchy to levy the tax, so they did it for the big corporations. There was a 3% tax levied. The colonists thought this was an outrage. They said, no taxation without representation, and because of this, we are going to go to war. Speaking of war, have you ever wondered why America is so easily to always be at war? With the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank in 1913, which coincided with the creation of the federal income tax, the federal government now had endless revenue, and because of that, they are able to fight endless war. Because without endless revenue, it's very difficult to maintain war over long periods of time, which is why historically bankers have used governments being in war, their need to fight wars during times that war was actually necessary, to leverage the creation of Federal Reserve type systems where the banks get a monopoly over the creation of money. This way governments could fight the war, and once that monopoly is created, there's no getting rid of it. But after 1913, well, now America's able to go to World War I, they're able to fight World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War, endless war on terror, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, war in Syria, everywhere in the world, because they have this endless supply of debt money that the government's giving IOUs to the Federal Reserve Bank, and that the American people, don't worry, we'll just tax the shit out of them and we'll pay for your endless war. So if you didn't have this system, you would have your cure to war. America would no longer be able to fight these endless wars. And speaking of the Revolutionary War, which was fought over the motto, no taxation without representation, do you feel that the American people have an actual choice in presidential elections, in federal elections, that the American people have great control over the Senate as it may be? The same oligarchy that controls the banking system and controls so much of our society, controls the news media and all these major institutions, controls the politicians, right? The same oligarchs at the top, they pour money to the Democrats and the Republicans. And anyone who wants to gain political power has to go through the Council on Foreign Relations. They have to get the stamp of approval from those in power. And once you get that stamp of approval, you pass the checklist of the establishment. Okay, now we'll pour endless money into your political campaign and you could get elevated into the Senate or into the presidency. So we have an illusion of choice, but there's no party offering the complete repeal of the federal income tax, the removal of taxation. It's, do you want to be robbed by the Democratic Party at 30% or the Republican Party at 25%? Because if we don't have a choice over taxation, if it's not a voluntary thing, then what it really is giving the government, which has a monopoly over the use of force, the ability to take people's money at gunpoint. And if they're taking people's money at gunpoint, under the threat of imprisonment, then it can't be, taxation can't be altruistic, it can't be charitable, right? If you are giving the government the authority to take people's money at gunpoint, something they don't have a choice over, they don't have a say in, and if they don't give the government that money, then they'll be thrown in a prison, you are advocating for what can only be described as an immoral act. Giving the government and its monopoly over the use of force the authority to take people's money at the threat of imprisonment is not altruistic, it is not charitable, it can only be described in one way: it is immoral, because taxation is theft.